Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mia Tata, and I am part of the research team at the People's Forum, Political and Popular Education Space, and Movement Incubator Center based in New York City. I want to start by thanking our co-sponsor for this event, Haymarket Books. This event is the first in a series of book talks that we are hosting this fall, and you can check those out and RSVP on our website at peoplesforum.org. To begin this event, I'm very excited to introduce Professor Keeanga Yamahtta Taylor, who is joining us back virtually at the People's Forum. Today, we will be discussing the updated and expanded edition of her book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. The first edition, released in 2016, won the Lannan Cultural Freedom Award for an especially notable book. It has been republished this past summer with a new chapter and a new foreword by Angela Davis. There isn't much I can say about Keeanga Yamahtta Taylor that hasn't already been said, but I think this book in particular highlights that she not only always provides a critical analysis on the endless junctures between race and class, that she also provides an expansive historical understanding of the movements that brought us here and where and how we must struggle in the present for a liberation and a socialist future. Keeanga is a professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University and also the author of Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership, and the editor of How We Get Free: Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective. Finally, both versions of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation are available for purchase and pre-order at our bookstore, which you can visit online at 1804books.com. And without further ado, I welcome Keeanga, and I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Mia. Very happy to be here with everyone tonight. So what I'm going to do is talk about the new edition of my book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, that has some new material, which, as Mia said, it has a new foreword from Angela Davis, and it has a new chapter at the end of the book, which is really my efforts to look at the movement 5 years after the eruptions in Ferguson, to really try to draw some conclusions about where the movement was at that particular time, what I thought its trajectory might be, where what direction the movement was headed in. Which, of course, you could say something about in 2019, but would have a completely different, you'd have a completely different picture of that after the summer of 2020, when it felt as if the movement erupted and it exploded in a very dramatic way. So I can, talk some about that. I hope that we can have a productive discussion at the end of my remarks. But what I want to do now is kind of talk about why I wrote the book, and what was it that I was trying to accomplish with this book? Because in some ways, it was written in. I began writing it in January of 2015. It came out, it was published in January 2016. I think I turned in the final draft in July of 2015. And so in many ways, that was very early in the lifespan of what would become popularly known as Black Lives Matter. But really, what I thought that I was doing, and the reason why I agreed to write the book is because even though it was early, some of the questions that I had been interested in, political questions that I had been interested in over a much longer period of time, seem to be coming together at this moment within the context of this movement. And I think pretty early on in the lifespan of what would become Black Lives Matter, there were fairly intense debates about the nature of the problem. There were intense debates about how do we resolve these issues concerning racism and police violence. There were questions about electoralism and electoral politics. There were questions about the possibility of reforming the police and whether or not that was something, not only a question as to whether it was possible, but was it even desirable as an objective of the movement? And even, what seemed like basic questions, but again, we saw the reemergence of, in a much more dramatic way last summer, what is racism? What is meant by systemic racism? It wasn't necessarily, the question was not posed that sharply in 2015 and in 2016, but certainly the question as to why this continues to happen to African Americans, why this continues to be a feature of life for Black people in the United States, raised deep, abiding questions about the function and role of racism in American society. And then finally, big questions about Black politics and the role of Black elected officials and their ability or inability to effectively intervene in the matters of the state and police brutality in ways that could actually solve the problem. And so these are issues that immediately arose to the forefront of this movement very early on. And so I decided to write the book as a way to engage with those questions. And I felt like I could do that because I was, at that time, I was moving, I had just moved to Philadelphia, July 25th. So literally weeks before the explosion in Ferguson. But if you read my book and Barbara Ransby's book about making all Black Lives Matter, in particular, and just some of the what has been written about this movement, that it began obviously the strands that would eventually develop into what we understood to be the Ferguson Rebellion, and then what eventually would come to be known as Black Lives Matter, began much earlier. And so that is also something that I wanted to talk about in the book, because I had been writing articles about the movement as it was happening. And I thought that this was the kind of expression of tension that had been building over a long period of time. And so I had just moved to Philadelphia a few weeks before, but previously when I lived in Chicago, I had been deeply involved in several iterations of organizing against state violence in the form of the death penalty in Illinois. I had worked with a group, the Campaign to End the Death Penalty, which also was working with Black men on death row in Illinois, Black men who had been tortured into making confessions to capital crimes and then were being threatened with execution based on those forced confessions. And so I had been very involved with that. And it was a quick pivot from that organizing around John Burge and police torture in Chicago to what really began to open up around police brutality, and really a whole kind of questioning of the status quo that came into fruition 2010, 2011. And so particularly around the questions of police abuse and violence in Chicago, there were high profile cases that were happening alongside the same time as the murder of Trayvon Martin in the winter of 2012, which some people see as really the beginning of this kind of Black Lives Matter consciousness. In Chicago, the case was the murder of Rekia Boyd, who was killed by an off-duty cop who shot into a crowd of young Black people gathered around the edge of a park on the west side of Chicago. And I had been very involved in the organizing around Rekia Boyd's murder. I think a week after she was killed, I helped to organize a meeting in Chicago that brought her brother out, that brought the family of Emmett Till together, and a handful of other cases of the family members of people who had been murdered by Chicago police into a meeting to talk about this issue of police violence in Chicago, and linking that to the burgeoning movement around Trayvon Martin in Florida, and how this had the potential to become really a national movement. The Malcolm X grassroots movement had begun to really try to record instances of police abuse and violence. And they came up with their own analysis that a Black person was killed by an agent of the state, or someone, a kind of parallel agent to the state, every 28 hours. And so this kind of developing Black Lives Matter consciousness was happening within a larger context of the shadow of the Occupy movement that had also come in the aftermath, or, there's kind of overlapping in time, the Arab Spring, the showdown around with public sector workers in Wisconsin, and the confrontation with the right-wing governor of the state at that time, Scott Walker. And this was all in the aftermath of the economic crisis of 2008. And so I wanted to write about these things, and I wanted to write about how Black Lives Matter, even at its earliest moments, represented a real deep political threat to the political status quo in the United States in ways that the Black movement always does, which is to say that the US is a society that is deeply vested in its national mythologies and its national ideology around American exceptionalism and the American dream, and that this is the greatest country in the history of mankind. But the Black movement has a way, even though Black people are a minority in the United States, of always unraveling the internal logic of that. Indigenous people and African Americans are the kind of consistent group that you can point to, and there's no golden era of when these were groups that were able to realize the fruits of the supposed fruits of American society. Of course, you could say that about different immigrant groups as well. But there is a dynamic where immigrants who have been attracted or drawn to the United States, many of whom have had some illusion at some point in time that this was a place where you could set down your roots and create a particular kind of future for yourself. And in the case of African Americans, there's no period in American history from enslavement to at the end of enslavement, 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, at the end of Jim Crow segregation, the onset of mass incarceration, where for ordinary Black people, that there has been some golden era of freedom in the United States. And so the Black movement in kind of raising these questions about the place of Black people in American society has always been particularly disruptive. Martin Luther King, I began the book with a quote from an article from King that was published after his death in 1969, where he talked about the threat of the Black movement exposing what he describes as systemic, not superficial flaws in the United States. And those flaws were the movement of Black people exposed those flaws to be militarism, poverty, racism, what he described as the triplets of oppression. And so I wanted to look at that because King is obviously talking about the Black movement of the 1960s, and look at that as a framework for how we could understand the incredibly disruptive impact of Black Lives Matter. And so that was kind of the wider context of why I wrote the book. I would say that the three things that I wanted to really emphasize and underline with this book were one, that this was really the first Black social movement to emerge in the US since the Civil Rights era, since the Civil Rights movement and then the Black insurgency of the late 1960s and 1970s. And that is to say that doesn't mean that this was the first time that people had engaged in any kind of political struggle, but this was really the kind of first sustained Black social movement since that time. And there had been other kinds of fits and starts where you could see that the potential for a movement existed, whether it was the LA Rebellion in 1992. At the end of the 1990s, there was an emergent movement against what had come to be known as racial profiling. I think that phrase was coined in 1995. And the high point of that movement really began to erupt in the early 2000s with the murder of, there were probably three things that contributed really to the development of that movement. I'll say four things. One was an investigation that found that Black motorists on Interstate 95 were multiple times over more likely to be stopped by police under the suspicion of drug currying. This is where the phrase "driving while Black" came from. And then there were a succession of cases of abuse or murder by police. There was of course, this name is going to escape me right now, Abner Louima in 1997 in New York, who was sexually assaulted by police with a plunger in a police precinct in Brooklyn. There was the case of Amadou Diallo, who, of course, was shot at 41 times, I believe hit with 19 bullets, unarmed in the Bronx. And then outside of New York, there's the case of Timothy Thomas in Cincinnati, in the summer, August of 2001. And so you had, in reaction to the case of Timothy Thomas, a rebellion exploded in Cincinnati. And so you had a succession of cases, even from 1997 to 2001, but in this kind of rising, not just consciousness, but anger at the kind of wanton police abuse, where people are making connections between cases on a national level. It goes from protest around Louima to even larger protests and direct action and civil disobedience in reaction to the murder of Amadou Diallo, to full-scale rebellion in the aftermath of the murder of Timothy Thomas. And what ends all of that, of course, are the September 11th attacks on September 11th, 2001. And it reconfigures like the entire understanding of security. It legitimizes. This movement began as a protest against racial profiling, and it legitimizes racial profiling, so much so that Black people come out in favor of racial profiling of Arabs for a brief time, but they came out in favor of it nonetheless. And then the legitimacy of the rearming, militarization of police, the kind of deification of police, the soldierizing of police, the concept of the first responder, all of that overwhelms the emergent developing movement against police brutality this time. So when the BLM movement emerges, it comes out of this long period of police abuse and violence continuing to happen, but no real sustained outward expression of protest against it. Of course, you have local campaigns and all that sort of thing, but the kind of national scope that we saw last summer, that we saw in the summer of 2014, that we saw in the aftermath of the Baltimore uprising in the spring of 2015, that had nothing on that scale had been seen. And so I wanted to talk about that. The second thing was I wanted to examine the way that the movement shattered all discussion about the US entering into a period of post-racialism, about the US being beyond racism, about the kind of glow from the Obama administration representing a new era in American politics and Black life, whether we had come to the end of Black politics, a question that was posed by the New York Times in August of 2009. I wanted to show that the movement was a refutation of that. And in fact, ironically, that it was precisely because of the victory of Barack Obama, because of the fact that we had more Black people in Congress than at any other point in time in American history, that is part of what radicalized young Black people. Because if given all of this concentration of Black political power, that those people were not in a position to actually stop police abuse, violence, and murder against ordinary Black people, then we had reached the end of that as a viable political solution, and young people would have to take it in their own hands to stop this. And so that was not what was expected. But I think that people underestimated the anger and frustration of young Black people, people who had voted for Obama like they had never voted for anyone before, people who believed in Yes, We Can, people who believed that Obama offered an alternative. And when he was not able to even speak clearly or coherently to the frustrations of young Black people when he was considering the political calculations of what it would mean for him to speak out against the police, against this kind of wanton abuse of Black people by police. He could not do that. And his inability to do that is what was part of the radicalization of young Black people. And so I wanted to look at the Black politics and the, chapter 3, Black places, Black faces in high places, is an examination of the kind of post-civil rights era of Black entry, mass entry into electoral politics and the political establishment, and to really think about and assess what that has meant for ordinary Black people. And so that was one of my chief objectives. The last thing was that I wanted to think about how the Black Lives Matter movement opened up the potential to not just examine or challenge police brutality, to not just challenge the conditions that made Black people vulnerable to police brutality, but to really challenge, to see the connection between police brutality, between the conditions that make Black people vulnerable to police brutality, and our entire political apparatus. I wanted to raise the question of whether we could go from Black Lives Matter to a much larger political project of Black liberation. And so I wanted to just end with, I'm a couple of minutes over time, but I wanted to end my opening comments with the beginning, the first couple of pages of chapter 7, which is in the original text is the last chapter of the book. But I wanted to just read some briefly from the chapter titled From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, to give you a sense of what I'm trying to get at with that, the third point that I raised, of how we can go from a reform on a specific issue to a much more radical struggle. And by radical, meaning upheaval. Radical means to get down to the root of what the problem is. The root of the problem is not police brutality. The root of the problem is social inequality, is the maldistribution of wealth. The police are there to maintain that disorganization of society. So to that effect, they are a symptom of the problem, but not the problem itself. So I wrote, on April 12th, 1865, the American Civil War officially came to an end when the Union Army accepted the unconditional surrender of the Confederacy on the steps of a courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. The Union Army, led by 200,000 Black soldiers, had destroyed the institution of slavery. And as a result of their victory, Black people were now to be no longer property, but citizens of the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first declaration of civil rights in the United States, stated that, quote, citizens of every race and color without regard to any previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude shall have the same right in every state and territory of the United States to full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property as enjoyed by white citizens. There was no ambiguity that the war had buried chattel slavery once and for all. Days after the surrender of the Confederacy, Abraham Lincoln rode into Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the slaveholders, where he stood upon the stairs of the former Confederate Capitol building and told a large gathering of Black people days into their freedom, in reference to you, colored people, let me say, God has made you free. Although you have been deprived of your God-given rights by your so-called masters, you are now as free as I am. And if those that claim to be your superiors do not know that you are free, take the sword and bayonet and teach them that you are free. For God created all men free, giving to each the same rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 150 years later, on April 12th, 2015, at 9 in the morning, 217 miles north of Appomattox, Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old Black man, was arrested by the Baltimore police. His only apparent crime was making eye contact with the police and then running away. Freddie Gray was loaded into a van. By the time he emerged 45 minutes later, his voice box had been crushed, his neck snapped, and 80% of his spinal cord severed. The distance from the end of the Civil War with the birth of Black citizenship and civil rights to the state-sanctioned beating and torture of Freddie Gray constitutes the gap between formal equality before the law and the self-determination and self-possession inherent in actual freedom. The right to be free from oppression, the right to make determinations about your life, free from duress, coercion, or threat of harm. Freedom in the United States has been elusive, contingent, and fraught with contradictions and unattainable promises for almost everyone. Black people were not freed into an American dream, but into what Malcolm X described as an American nightmare of economic inequality and unchecked injustice. The full extent of this inequality was masked by racial terrorism. 100 years after emancipation, African Americans dismantled the last vestiges of legal discrimination with the civil rights movement. But the excitement of the movement quickly faded as American cities combusted with Black people who were angry and disillusioned at being locked out of accessing the riches of American society. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans participated in uprisings in search of resolution to the problems of lead poisoning, rat infestation, hunger and malnutrition, undernourishment, underemployment, poor schools, and persisting poverty. Where liberals and radicals often converged was in the demand that Blacks should have greater political control over their communities. For liberals, Black electoral politics was a sign of political maturity as the movement left the streets for the poll booth, urban governance, and community control. The problem was not the quote system, it was exclusion from access to all that American society had to offer. Some radicals were also lured by the possibility of self-government and community control. Indeed, it was a viable strategy, given that much of Black life was controlled by white elected officials and white-led institutions. The question remained, though, could the machinery wielded in oppression of Blacks now be retooled in the name of Black self-determination? If freedom had in one era been imagined as inclusion in the mainstream of American society, including admittance to its political and financial institutions, then the last 50 years have yielded a mixed record. Indeed, since the last gasps of the Black insurgency of the 1970s, there are many measures of Black accomplishment and achievement in a country where Black people were never intended to survive as free people. Is there no greater symbol of a certain kind of Black accomplishment than a Black president? For those who consider mastery of American politics and Black political representation as the highest expression of inclusion in the mainstream, then we are surely in the heyday of American race relations. Yet paradoxically, at a moment when African Americans have achieved what no rational person could have imagined when the Civil War ended, we have simultaneously entered a new period of Black protests, Black radicalization, and the birth of a new Black left. No one knows what will come of this new political development, but many know the causes of its gestation. For as much success as some African Americans have achieved, 4 million Black children live in poverty, 1 million Black people are incarcerated, and 240,000 Black families lost their homes as a result of the foreclosure crisis, resulting in the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in Black savings. Never before in American history has a Black president presided over the misery of millions of Black people. The denial of the most basic standards for health, happiness, and basic humanity. Entertainer and activist Harry Belafonte Jr. recalled his last conversation with Martin Luther King Jr., in which he lamented, quote, "I have come up upon something that disturbs me deeply. We have fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have, and I know that we will win. But I've come to believe that we're integrating into a burning house. The aspirations for Black liberation," close quote, "the aspirations for Black liberation cannot be separated from what happens in the United States as a whole. Black life transformed while Black life cannot be transformed while the rest of the country burns. The fires consuming the United States are stoked by the widespread alienation of low wage and meaningless work, unaffordable rents, suffocating debt, and poverty. The essence of economic inequality is borne out in a simple fact. There are 400 billionaires in the United States and 45 million people living in poverty. These are not parallel facts, they are intersecting facts. There are 400 American billionaires because there are 45 million people living in poverty. Profit comes at the expense of the living wage. Corporate executives, university presidents, and capitalists in general are living the good life because so many others are living a life of hardship. The struggle for Black liberation, then, is not an abstract idea molded in isolation from the wider phenomenon of economic exploitation and inequality that pervades all of American society. It is intimately bound up with them. The struggle for Black liberation requires going beyond the standard narrative that Black people have come a long way, but have a long way to go, which of course says nothing about where it is that we are actually trying to get to. It requires understanding the origins and nature of Black oppression and racism more generally. Most importantly, it requires a strategy, some sense of how we get from the current situation to the future. Perhaps at its most basic level, Black liberation implies a world where Black people can live in peace without the constant threat of the social, economic, and political woes of a society that place almost no value on the vast majority of Black lives. It would mean living in a world where Black lives matter. While it is true that when Black people get free, everyone gets free, Black people in America cannot get free alone. In that sense, Black liberation is bound up with the project of human liberation and social transformation. So that's what I was trying to get at. And I think, that's from 2015. And I think it's still part of the key questions that this movement and its various iterations are continuing to try to take up. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keeanga. And just to reiterate for everybody, if you're tuning in on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. And if you're on YouTube, you can use the chat box. I have a question that and you hinted at it a little bit in the beginning, Keeanga, but the uprisings of 2020, I think that people think that in the popular narrative, it was catalyzed by the murder of George Floyd. And I think that people often think that it was sort of a spontaneous thing that erupted and the momentum carried it into what it was. I'm wondering if you can address the ways that it was not necessarily spontaneous and the conditions that had led to this uprising. And to follow up with that, how has the struggle for Black liberation changed since then? What does it look like now in this presumably post-COVID era?
Yeah. So I think to begin with, I think that I mean, the protest and the rebellion in 2020, I think was many things. I think, of course, there was certainly a spontaneous element to it that was activated by this brutal lynching that everyone is home and quarantining and the kind of lockdown that we were all subjected to meant that a lot of people, probably much more than under normal circumstances, and it was on a holiday weekend, Memorial Day weekend, really absorbed the sheer insanity and brutality of that act. And of course, it was coming. I mean, yes, there are the kind of long history of brutality and pent up frustration and anger with the conditions of racism. But I think it's important to say, to recognize the ways that the pandemic put a particular focus on those things in ways that are typically shrouded, right? I think that, poor housing, the being trapped in low wage labor has been a reality of working class Black life in particular since emancipation, right? And so this is not a revelation to Black people, but segregation is real. And part of the impact of segregation is that, people have some inkling, you see popular culture and, you have some inkling about what goes on in Black neighborhoods, but for the most part, not, And so for a few months, the kind of disproportionate impact of the virus in Black communities that, in many of these places, cities across the country, for a couple of months, Black people were the majority of people dying from the virus. There was this focus on so-called essential workers. I say so-called because they've never been treated like essential workers. They've never been paid like essential workers. But this is how they were being referred to in the media. And so there was a laser focus on the conditions of inequality, really for the first time in a very long time in the United States. And I think for some people, it was revelatory. It was part of an awakening. I think that's why the protests were so large in the protests that would come in the summer. But I think for Black people, and especially young Black people, it was also a part of this process of radicalization. And so it was both. It was an explosion in response to longstanding patterns of racism and indignity. But those patterns exist all the time, and they don't produce that kind of outcry. They don't produce that kind of response. And so it was, I think, a kind of pent up immediate reaction to the murder of George Floyd, overlaid with the conditions of the pandemic that gave rise to the explosion. But the longevity of those protests, which went on for the entire into September, that was because of longstanding issues. That was because these were longstanding problems. I think where we are at today in the struggle for Black liberation, I think many of the things that I read from in the last chapter of the book remain true. In some ways, perhaps even more so. I think probably the most interesting dynamic that exists today is the complete breakdown in Black politics, and the idea that there is a shared fate among all Black people, or the idea that any Black elected official represents the interests of ordinary Black people. I think we saw the beginnings, not the kind of intensification of the fracturing around that idea during the primaries of 2020, where you had, these Black elected officials coming out for Michael Bloomberg, then Michael Bloomberg's comments about racial profiling being revisited. You've had these congressional races with Cori Bush and William Lacey in St. Louis, with Jamal Bowman in the Bronx. I mean, you've had these contests that, and Bowman was his opponent was white, but the Congressional Black Caucus backed the white opponent. And so all of the kind of tensions around class within the Black community, I think, have heightened. And it raises questions then about solidarity, about what kind of coalitions do African Americans need to be vested in, to engage in, to create a real alternative to the politics of the Democratic Party establishment that kind of run through elected Black officials that not only don't represent an alternative to the status quo, but have doubled down on the status quo. There is an insane race in Buffalo, New York, for the mayor of the city. So it's not a congressional race, but it's a race about who will be mayor of the second largest city in New York State, and it's two Black people running against each other, and they could not be more different. You have Byron Brown, who is a political boss, who has been mayor of Buffalo for 16 years, who is a creature of the New York political establishment, a protege of Andrew Cuomo, against India Walton, who is a working class Black woman, a former welfare recipient and teenage mother, who has been smeared in the press because of her background, but who defines herself as a democratic socialist and has a completely different vision for what the future should look like in Buffalo. And so no matter who you support in that race, you can see that this is not just the politics of representation at stake. There are vastly different ideas about what needs to happen to improve the lives of poor and working class Black people in Buffalo, of which, the poverty rate among African Americans in Buffalo is over 30%. And so it's a real critical question. So I think that the tensions and contradictions within Black politics have been magnified 100-fold since I wrote this book the first time.
Great, thank you so much. And then another question I have, and something that I've definitely been thinking about, is so the summer of 2020 had this large and the most visible mass mobilization since Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I felt like the past 3 weeks have been a whirlwind of some of the most devastating national and statewide policy and legislative blows to the working class. So we have the ending of the eviction moratorium, the ending of COVID-era unemployment assistance, the undermining of voting rights and reproductive rights in different states across the country.
And the end of COBRA healthcare subsidies.
And you mentioned that these movements are addressing the social conditions that are underlining this, and yet we have these things that have happened in the past few weeks. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about that in the context of our continued struggle for Black liberation.
Sure. I mean, one of the key questions that I raised in the book in chapter, I believe it's chapter 5, is about what are we building? What what kinds of organizations are we building? Because we know historically that the physical momentum from street protests, riots, rebellions is limited, right? There is only so far that level or kind of protest can sustain itself. And so if you don't have organization coming out of that, then it's not clear how you move forward. It's not clear how you move from that to the next steps, which have to do with changing the law, dismantling things, all those sorts of questions that are tied up in politics and strategy and tactics. Those are things that flow from organization, being organized, not one big group or two big groups, but coalitions, groups that bring representatives or individuals from different kinds of political work together. And it is a step that, in my opinion, and this is some of what I write about in the new chapter at the end of the book, when looking at, from 2014 to 2019, what is different in the movement at that point. And it's the same question that we are confronted with today. And so early on in the movement, the question was, do we need organizations at all? There was an assumption because of the important role that social media had played in the development of the BLM consciousness, the rise of generalization really about the prevalence of police brutality, and also the way that social media became a tool for quickly organizing, for being able to quickly pivot. Some people mistook that as a substitute for traditional kinds of organizing, face-to-face organizing, political meetings, building political coalitions, building political organizations. And I think that, we've seen kind of the arc of thinking that Twitter can resolve all the problems that came from traditional organizing, because we still have this vacuum and this hole that continues to exist. And so I think, it's not to say that there have been no organizations. There's a proliferation of, all kinds of foundation funded NGOs that emerged out of this, all kinds of grant receiving organizations. And, some of these groups have been very important and they've played very important roles. But when trying to build a national movement, in my opinion, you need organizations, national focused, nationally based organizations that have a way of communicating across regions, that have a way to generalize experiences, problems across regions, across localities, that provide a way for people to be able to gauge the strength or the weaknesses of the movement as a national phenomenon. And without that, then you can have little groups in particular enclaves that might do extremely brilliant work in that locality. But we have to have a national movement if we intend to challenge what is a national program of destruction, devastation, disinvestment, and attacks on the working class. We have to have national organizations in addition to local grassroots organizing. And also we need those groups, both nationally and locally, to be able to talk about politics, to be able to talk about the political questions that continue to animate the movement that don't actually get addressed, that are not subject to political debate. And so there are huge questions that pervade our social movements. The questions about electoral politics, Can we vote our way out of these problems? Is that the wrong question to pose? Should we be thinking strategically about some elections coupled with other kinds of direct organizing? There are all sorts of political, what is the system in systemic racism? And we could think of a million different questions that animate our movements that have no place exists to engage these debates. What is the Black Lives Matter movement? Does it exist? Is it going anywhere? Where is it going? What are the crucial questions within that? Nowhere is there a space to engage these questions. And so if you can't really engage in the questions that animate the movement, then it raises questions about what this movement is and how will it be able to move forward. And so those were questions that I raised in 2015. Those are questions that I raised again in 2019. Those are questions that are most prominent for people coming out of 2020, feeling like this was a decisive moment in the history of the Black movement in particular, and a year later feeling like, what was that? What just happened? And where are we at now? And so that, I think these are crucial issues to continue to grapple with.
Thank you so much. A lot to think about, definitely. Yeah. And I want to keep to time, so I'm just going to ask my sort of last question, which is sort of what are your thoughts on this sort of new generation of activists and organizers that have come out of 2020, mobilized heavily in 2020, and if you could talk just a bit about how they've grappled with what you've called this Black Lives Matter consciousness in 2020 and in this present moment, and then also if you have any words of wisdom for this generation of organizers.
Well, I think that in some ways it's incredibly impressive. I mean, if you look at the work that people did in response to the pandemic and all of the mutual aid and the ability to pivot so quickly, and these people who were working and doing the organizing around mutual aid, of course, came out of Black Lives Matter streams of activism and organizing. And so then, the struggle was fed in the opposite direction, meaning that the people who were involved in organizing mutual aid then, of course, quickly pivoted to the eruption of protest after the murder of George Floyd. And I think the reason why the movement so quickly advanced much more complex demands in 2020, from defunding, immediately moving to defunding the police, and to raising systemic issues, really kind of represented the political continuity from the early phase of in Ferguson to its development in 2020, in the summer of 2020. Because if people will recall, in the aftermath of Ferguson and the protests that emerged nationally in the fall of 2014, there was a lot of focus on body cameras for police. Activists acquiesced to Obama, who wanted to create a commission on policing. He put activists on the commission for policing. The White House had an open door policy for BLM police brutality activists during that time. And so people had learned from those experiences. People drew a lot of the right conclusions. And so while the media was aghast at, you know, something like defund the police, and the Democratic Party was equally offended. They failed to recognize that this is the maturation of the failed responses of reform that came in the earlier period. If the body cameras had worked, right? If Obama's police commission had stopped police brutality, then people would not be demanding to defund the police. And so I think that it showed political continuity, it showed political maturity. And I think that we have to take that next step of developing political organizations out of that exist on a large scale, because we don't have the benefit that the right does, which the right has the Republican Party, which it utilizes to shape public debate, to intervene in public debates. The Democratic Party is not that. The left does not have that relationship to the Democratic Party. It's a big tent with an incredibly muddled message that is intended to assuage all different factions. And so what we are missing is a left voice that exists in politics, that can shape public opinion, that can shape, intervene in political debates, that give expression to the left-wing sentiment that exists in the population, that has no expression. We have a Congress full of millionaires and you know, and a couple of billionaires in the Senate who are making political determinations about our future. And so all of the desire for state-funded healthcare has no expression, because our Congress is, you know, is shaped by healthcare lobbyists and people who have an interest in the status quo. So I think that this generation is healthy and moving in the right direction, and we need political organization to give it its full expression in politics.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Keeanga.
Thank you.
We are a little bit over time, so I think I'm just going to close it out. But thank you so much, Keeanga Yamahtta Taylor. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you again to our co-sponsor, Haymarket Books. And once again, you can visit 1804books.com to purchase both editions of Keeanga's book. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us.